Fantasy and sci-fi writers love coming up with new species and new cultures, new civilizations. But wouldn't you know it, often is the case when you're exploring strange new worlds, not everybody's going to speak English or whatever the author's native language is. Inevitably, there are going to be differences in language. So when you're writing a science fiction or fantasy story or world building new cultures, how do you deal with that language gap in fiction? So in this video, I wanted to break down 8 different methods that authors can use to tackle this as it comes up when writing your fantasy or your science fiction story. So first, let's start with the most obvious and basic one, which is realism, depicting overcoming a language barrier based on tactics real people have access to now or can be reasonably extrapolated on in the near future, as exemplified by this 20-year-old image of me at Kinkakuji in Japan with my host brother Makoto and his mom. I was not a fluent Japanese speaker at the time. I did know some, and we were able to have some communication, but where language barriers persisted, there needed to be other ways around that. It could be something like pointing to an object to find out what the word for that object is. It could be using a gestures or miming to try to, make somebody understand through motion what it is that you're trying to get at. It could be drawing an object on a piece of paper to say, "Hey, I'm talking about this." It could be translation programs on smartphones or having an AI do it. So the realism approach is trying to think through just how would two people actually do this without really going into the realm of advanced magics or science fiction technologies. The second method is the Star Trek method, where some universal translator exists. It's a technology that's broadly available and it handles all of the translation on the back end, so characters don't have to worry about it. They just speak their language and the other party happens to understand them. Conflict can then come up if, for some reason, the technology or the magic stops working. This is the route that I went with my Planner Gates series, where anybody who walks through a Planner Gate has an enchantment placed upon them that helps them understand the language of every being that has ever walked through a Planner Gate. So just by walking through one, you have universal translation magic basically stamped upon you. And it also allows you to understand people who may not have gone through a Planner Gate themselves, because I'm creating lots of different species and cultures, and I really wanted to lean into the sociology of all of these different cultures. Plus, there's different species. Think about like a race of intelligent salamanders or octopus and different humanoids. I didn't want language barriers to be a thing when I'm already talking about species differences and cultural differences and all of that. So I just dealt with it with the universal translation method. There's also the Star Wars method, as exemplified by C-3PO, where translators are specialized. So I would describe C-3PO as different than a universal translator because a universal translator is widely distributed technology. C-3PO is an individual character. So this puts the burden of translation duties into a single point of failure with a specific character, and there's more room for conflict in there. There's also more room for knowledge gaps. C-3PO may be fluent in 6 million forms of communication, but that doesn't mean that C-3PO knows every form of communication. So what obscure thing might be out there that C-3PO doesn't know? Up next, we have what I call the Highlander method, because there can only be one. Employing this strategy means that there is no language barriers in a book or a universe because there is only one language. So you've got either a monoculture situation where only one language ever developed, or you have a situation where only one language remains because some invading or colonizing force wiped out the speakers of every other language. So if you're establishing a universe where there is only one language, there may need to be an in-universe explanation for why language barriers never come up at all. Next, you've got what I call the avatar or the like a dragon method, which is where a specific choice is made to acknowledge that a language barrier exists and then tell the audience that you can't be bothered to deal with it. So in Avatar, the second movie, Way of Water, it opens with a montage of Jake Sully and his family and everybody speaking Na'vi. And Jake makes the point that he's become so familiar with the Na'vi language that it's like English to him. And for the rest of the movie, if Jake Sully is around, the Na'vi characters are speaking English. And it's a nod to the audience's way of saying, look, they're all really speaking Na'vi, but so that we don't have to have the entire script in this invented language and have people read subtitles the entire movie, we're actually just having it as English. You know, it's an audience convenience way of waving it away. Or in the Like a Dragon games, the last few, Infinite Wealth and Pirate Yakuza in Hawaii, they have Japanese characters in Hawaii where people are speaking English, and they basically go, yeah, we know these characters haven't taken the time to learn English. We're not interested in having some long extended, learning the language thing. Just don't deal with it. And so in their own ways, the games just straight up say, yeah, we're not concerning ourselves with a language barrier. There's no translator character. There's no in-universe justification really for why they know English. We now just, wink, nod, assume they somehow learned English. And given the insanity of those types of games, I think the audience is just going to go along with it. Nobody's going to get hung up on a language barrier. We just want to enjoy the fantasy of being Japanese gangsters doing crazy over the top things. So I don't think anybody minds, but they do explicitly have a moment where they look at the audience, they break the fourth wall and go, yeah, we know this doesn't really make sense. We're doing it anyway. Up next, this one happens in reality all of the time, which is the third way of finding a mutually understood communication method. When I studied abroad in Japan, I met Korean exchange students to Japan who knew Korean but not Japanese, and Japanese students who didn't know Korean, but people from both countries learned English. So English became the language of understanding between the Korean and the Japanese students, where neither of them spoke the other's language, but because they both had learned English, they used English to communicate to each other. With more alien species, this could be a little more difficult. One method I have seen sci-fi universes handle is like in Star Wars, trade organizations or trade languages that handle a lot of different planets. They would invent their own language that all of these other different species would learn. So even though they had their own native language, that invented trade language became the third means of communication. Otherwise, you may have mutually understood concepts or images and create a language that's like pictographic in nature, where both species understand what a cheeseburger is. So you have a cheeseburger icon that represents food or something, just to make up a quick example. And that new developed system becomes the means of exchange between different species and cultures. There is the backstory dodge, which is giving your character skills that justify why a language barrier is not going to be an issue. If you were writing a thriller, it might involve a character who grew up in Europe, or maybe they had military parents and they grew up on a military base in Germany. And so they're frequently out in Germany, or, they grew up in another European country and they've been surrounded by Spanish and French and Italian. And you create a situation where their life story explains why they know multiple languages. So when the character inevitably finds themselves in a situation where those different languages are being spoken, readers already understand why that character knows what they know and knows how to get around. This is something I would recommend setting up front and just kind of placing details of the character's backstory in situations where it's relevant, kind of leading up to a moment where those skills are going to appear. If the first time we ever find out that they know Spanish and Italian and German and all these other languages is the moment that they're called upon to do so, that can feel a little bit cheap and convenient. There's really been no story buildup to justify it. So it can create a character that feels overpowered or a bit like a Mary Sue, Gary Stu type situation. So there are many valid character backgrounds that can lead to a character having a certain number of skills. It's just a matter of illustrating that to readers as to why they specifically don't have to worry about language barriers. And the last method of handling a language barrier is the most extreme, which is the brick wall. That something is going on between these cultures or these species that is so extreme that reconciling that barrier is going to be difficult or utterly impossible. Think, for example, a species that communicates in pheromones or other scent based triggers. They may be able to produce those scents and understand them, but can the human nose parse that to figure out what's going on? And even if we could, it's highly unlikely that we can reproduce that. Naturally, we would need to invent some sort of scent machine to even begin to hope to become close to replicating that. Or what about a species that is bioluminescent and can create some kind of light and they communicate through light, but the light they emit or the sounds they emit are outside the range of human perception? They could be talking to each other and having full conversations, and we wouldn't even know it because their means of communication is outside our ability to perceive. We couldn't naturally replicate their communication methods. Something else would have to be invented. And that assumes that their systems of thinking are close enough to humanity's that we can even discern how well they think enough to be able to build a meaningful means of crossing the intellectual and linguistic divides between us. So sometimes, it may be we're so alien from each other that it's just impossible to communicate. And oftentimes, if this is going to be an element in a story, that language barrier may be a huge portion of the plot itself, and great length is gone to explain the nature of the brick wall and the difficulties involved in overcoming it. And sometimes species can break through and find a third way or find a way to comprehend each other, and sometimes they just don't. And this can be an interesting but difficult means to play with if it is necessary for these extremely different characters to be able to understand each other. So there you have it. I listed 8 different means of handling the language divide in fiction. Do you have a method that I haven't discussed here? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts on these methods or any others that I have not thought of myself. And if you like the video, please be sure to like and subscribe. I believe it is legally required on YouTube to make that ask. Thanks. Have a great day.